So welcome and thanks again for joining us. So far this month, we've been talking about sacred service from different perspectives. I'm going to keep my focus there, but today what I want to do is I want to look at it from a bit of a different perspective. I'd like to explore the concept of action, the concept of right action from the perspective of the Tao. What does this ancient wisdom have to teach us about the steps we take today as we contemplate being of service? So first, a little background. When we think about Taoism, I think the first name that comes to mind is of the sage Lao Tzu, who many believe was born around 604 BCE. We know pretty much nothing about him. We don't even know his name. The phrase Lao Tzu, the name Lao Tzu, can be translated as old boy, old fellow, or grand old master. It's obviously not a name, but a term of endearment. We know very little about him. Scholars believe he was born in eastern China, in the province that is now Henan. He lived a quiet and an introspective life. He did not proselytize. He had no intention to form a philosophy or a religion. Religious historian Huston Smith calls Lao Tzu a shadowy figure. Legend has it that seeking solitude in his last years, Lao Tzu started out of town on a water buffalo and headed toward what is now Tibet. He was stopped at a mountain pass. After some conversation, the gatekeeper realized that this was an extraordinary person, and he asked Lao Tzu to dictate some of his philosophy to give to the civilization that he was leaving. So Lao Tzu stopped there for about 3 days, and when he was leaving, he gave the gatekeeper the Tao Te Ching, which is translated as the way and its power, 81 verses that can be read in under 2 hours. He then got back on his water buffalo and wasn't seen again. So again, this is legend and we don't know for sure if it happened. I think part of the point of the story is to tell us that the spread of this wonderful philosophy didn't depend on any concerted effort by Lao Tzu to institutionalize it. Perhaps it spread because its message rang so true to so many. Lao Tzu was a contemporary of Confucius. Now, Confucius found his solution in ritual and in tradition, but the Tao didn't include any of that. It was the exact, in many ways, opposite of that. The Tao teaches that there is a natural harmony underlying all things, encompassing all things, and that our highest good comes from spontaneous and authentic living in alignment with this truth. The Tao is a philosophy of balance, ease, and wholeness. Now, some mistake this philosophy to embrace a passiveness, a kind of a go-with-the-flow attitude that accepts whatever happens. That is so far from it. That is not at all what this philosophy is. The word used by the Tao is Wu Wei. The phrase translates as inaction. It's also been translated as effortless action. Huston Smith writes that its real meaning in the Taoist context is a combination of supreme activity and supreme relaxation. Supreme activity and at the same time, supreme relaxation. So this is a tough concept for us to grasp because it's very counterintuitive. How can these opposites be possible? How can we be supremely active and at the same time supremely relaxed? We can't be both. Taoism disagrees. Our essential nature is at our essence that we can be both. The seeming dichotomy is possible because we are not isolated, disconnected beings. We are born along in the energy, in the flow of the Tao or the way. When we can release our grip on our ego selves and surrender to that energy acting through us, we can be both supremely active and supremely relaxed at the same time, counterintuitive though it seems. If you have studied the Tao at all, you will appreciate its emphasis on the reconciliation of seeming opposites. We act, but the difference is we do it without meeting resistance or friction because we are acting in harmony with the way of all things. The image used frequently is that of water. It flows without effort, bearing up all that it carries. If we are in the river and we fight it, what happens? We struggle to stay afloat, we become exhausted, and we sink. However, if we surrender, we are borne along. So about 200 years after Lao Tzu, we saw the birth of another Taoist sage, Zhuangzi. He is credited with writing the classic Zhuangzi, which is the second foundational text of Taoism, and it is absolutely one of the classics of Chinese philosophic literature. His wisdom, his irreverent humor, his fables, and his stories have had great influence, including on Christian mystic Thomas Merton, who wrote The Way of Zhuangzi. Merton said in the foreword to that book that he enjoyed writing it more than any other book he could remember. So today, I want to bring together Zhuangzi, the Tao, the notion of effortless action, and leave you perhaps with some insights on how all this history and philosophy has some actual bearing on your life and some meaning as to how you can bring greater depth to the actions that you take. The primary resource I used for this talk is Parker Palmer's excellent book, The Active Life. I recommend it to you. Instead of simply talking about the notion of effortless action from the Taoist perspective, he illustrated it with a very well-known story by Zhuangzi. The tale is called The Woodcarver, and I share it with you now. King, K-H-I-N-G, King, the master carver, made a bell stand of precious wood. When it was finished, all who saw it were astounded. They said it must be the work of spirits. The Prince of Lu said to the master carver, "What is your secret?" King replied, "I am only a workman. I have no secret. There is only this. When I began to think about the work you commanded, I guarded my spirit, did not expend it on trifles that were not to the point. I fasted in order to set my heart at rest. After 3 days fasting, I had forgotten gain and success. After 5 days, I had forgotten praise or criticism. After 7 days, I had forgotten my body with all its limbs. By this time, all thought of your highness and of the court had faded away. All that might distract me from the work had vanished. I was collected in the single thought of the bell stand. Then I went to the forest to see the trees in their own natural state. When the right tree appeared before my eyes, the bell stand also appeared in it clearly, beyond doubt. All I had to do was put forth my hand and begin. If I had not met this particular tree, there would have been no bell stand at all. What happened? My own collected thought encountered the hidden potential in the wood. From this live encounter came the work which you ascribe to the spirits. There is so much beautiful imagery in that story. There is such depth in the process of preparing to make the bell stand, imaging the bell stand, and finally going about the work. There is much to unpack here that gives us wisdom about the actions we take. So Palmer identifies 4 elements of action in this story. The quality of the carver's actions are determined by how he relates to each. The same is true for us in our own actions. The 4 elements we must examine are motives, skills and gifts, the other, and results. Motives, skills and gifts, the other, and results. How we relate to each is what truly matters to the actions that we take. So first is motive. We have to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? This is a fundamental question, one we sometimes don't even explore very closely as we just jump into whatever it is we have to do. Palmer writes, every action has some motive behind it, a force field out of which it arises. If we do not explore that force, we will never act in a transcendent way. We will live out our lives as automatons who move but do not choose. We do not want that. Our motive for taking action dictates its very nature and often its result. To achieve effortless action, our motives must flow from our true internal essence, from the truth of who we are. So we look to the story as an example. The woodcarver, whose name is King, K-H-I-N-G, he doesn't make the bell stand on a whim, or even because he himself wants a bell stand. The prince commanded him to do it. The initial motive is external. In addition, given the culture of the time, if King had done a bad job, if he hadn't satisfied the prince, it would not have gone well. He might have been severely punished. He might even have been executed for his failure. However, King knows that in order to create a thing of beauty, such negative and punitive compulsion cannot be his motive. Think about your own life. What has been the result when you have acted from obligation, from compulsion, or perhaps even fear? How has such a motive diminished the final result? Palmer points out that many of our own actions may begin from such a place. They just do. However, we must find a process that enables us to move beyond such limited beginnings to a place that calls out of us our creativity, our joy, our love, the gifts that we use to fully co-create. So what does King do? He starts off with this external compulsion. Indeed, even the fear of death. He says, I guarded my spirit, did not expend it on trifles that were not to the point. He began to get past the fear, the possible consequences. I fasted in order to set my heart at rest. He was nervous. His heart was not at rest. He fasted in order to set his heart at rest. And then, after 3 days fasting, I had forgotten gain and success. After 5 days, I had forgotten praise or criticism. After 7 days, I had forgotten my body with all its limbs. And he goes on to forget even the prince. By this time, all thought of your highness and of the court had faded away. All that might distract me from the work had vanished. I was collected in the single thought of the bell stand. This fasting may have been a physical process, but it was also a psychological one. Chuang-Tzu likened fasting to forgetting. By fasting, King forgot, discarded what Palmer calls the psychic junk food of gain and success, praise and criticism. Even the prince himself, all the externals, he let them all fall away, and he had to do it before he could begin to create this thing of beauty. He did not permit all these external drivers to be loaded onto the work that he had to do. He knew that they had to go. He knew he must work from his own internal truth, not any of these false motivators. By focusing until he could move past all the distractions, he regained what Palmer calls his original unity, his wholeness, which is necessary for right action. Palmer writes that he suspects the woodcarver began by understanding that sometimes we must be outwardly called to our own internal truth, and that these callings may come from the most unlikely sources, such as a ruthless prince. The call may come from the wrong place or for the wrong reason, but that does not mean it is the wrong call. So think about parallels in your own life. Some task to which you are called, some obligation you have no choice but to fulfill. It happens all the time. It may be work, it may be family, even a volunteer obligation we just don't want to worry about right then. Instead of simply moving forward in resignation, is there a process that you can go through, a fasting, a forgetting, that enables you to claim your own internal authority, your own truth, to move forward in your own wholeness? That is the way we joyfully co-create. So the next element we must consider, Palmer calls skills and gifts. Here he asks us to consider the gifts we bring to the action we take. So back to the story. What skills did the woodcarver bring? In the first line of the story, he's identified as a master carver, and we may be tempted to stop there. It's an easy answer. He spent years cultivating and learning how to carve, how to be a master woodcarver. Surely these are the skills that made the difference. However, Chuang-Tzu suggests that is a vehicle to separate ourselves, to let ourselves off the hook. This is one point of the story. A work such as this, we tell ourselves, could only be done by a master, not by an ordinary person. Those who see the finished bell stand, they say it's so beautiful it could only be done by spirits. So that's the setup. This creation had to be the work of some agency beyond merely human. An ordinary person like me or like you could never have made something beautiful like that. However, the woodcarver himself won't let us off that hook. The prince asks the carver, "So what's your secret?" King replies, "I am only a workman. I have no secret." He then goes on to describe the process we talked about before of forgetting and fasting, removing distractions so that he can work from his own inner truth. Chuang-Tzu is telling us that this work was not the result of King's acquired skills so much as his inner gifts. Palmer calls these our birthright gifts, and he calls us to remember them and value them. We all have them, and far too often we diminish or we outright forget them. Palmer writes, "By spiritualizing and mystifying King's action, the people and the prince distance themselves from it and evade the challenge implicit in its very humanness. If they were to embrace the notion that King is only a workman, they would have to reflect upon and revitalize their own active lives. Instead, they let themselves off the hook by attributing the bell stand to something other than King's hard work and faithfulness to his gifts." When we consider our talents or our gifts, we tend to focus on those skills that we have acquired, that we have learned, perhaps because we had to work to get them. We say, "I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a teacher, a musician. Those are my skills." When others have these gifts, we gravitate toward looking at them and saying they are different from us. We look at their expertise and we say, "I could never have that." Palmer says that each of us is a master at something. Part of becoming fully alive is to discover and develop our birthright competence. Everyone has what Palmer calls birthright gifts. They are a part of us, and they are not the result of education or training. He separates our birthright gifts from our acquired skills, and he urges us to remember those gifts that arrived with us, that are only ours, which we did not have to learn. We were born with them. It's not easy, again, because we tend to focus on those skills we've acquired, like the woodcarver's skill in carving. But that's not what the woodcarver used to approach this task. Think about it. Instead, he used his ability to wait for insight to come, to take risks under pressure, to trust, to speak his truth, even to power. If he had just said, "I'm an expert woodcarver, I can fashion whatever I like out of any piece of wood," the result would not have been the same. Without these birthright skills, his acquired ability to carve would have made him nothing more than a skilled artisan, not enough to create such a thing of beauty. The qualities that made the difference were those he had already. So, what are your birthright gifts? Palmer says the place to start may be your childhood. Why? Because you ask yourself, what brought you pleasure? How did you spend your time before you became more aware of society's expectations and pressures? What did you naturally love to do? This may be the first place to look for those gifts that you have forgotten, which, when you remember them, are the foundation of your own joyful co-creation. The next element to consider is what Palmer calls the woodcarver's relation to the other. In the story, the other is the tree from which he carves the bell stand. However, Palmer tells us to remember that every aspect of our life involves an other. If you're a teacher, it's the student. If you're a parent, it might be your child, a doctor, the patient. The list just goes on. The point is that we do not create alone, but always in partnership with whatever or whoever that other is. Chuang-Tzu is telling us in this story that we must honor the essence of the other, whatever it is or whoever it is. The woodcarver says he entered into a live encounter with this particular tree. He waited until he saw the right tree, and then he entered into a live encounter with that particular tree, realizing it was a dynamic encounter with a unique living thing. When he considered this tree, the bell stand appeared beside it, and all he had to do was put out his hand and begin. He didn't go in with an image of the bell stand. It appeared when he stood and reflected on that particular tree. The other, whatever it is, surrounds us and is a living, integral player in our own actions, requiring our attention and our respect. So the final element is related, and it is consideration of results. So what does the story teach us here? Despite the compulsion from the prince and the risks to himself, King says that if he had not met this particular tree, there would have been no bell stand. He could not dictate the results, and indeed he was prepared to entirely forego the results. He had to act in accordance with his own inner nature, what he knew to be true about himself. He turned it around. It was not the result that was driving the process. He invested in the process. We cannot proceed thinking that the only actor is us, that we are here to work our will on all things. Creation is a dynamic process which must be followed rather than forced. It is a process of listening, of awareness, of responding, aware that we may not know the end, and we surely cannot compel it. Chuang-Tzu calls us to have reverence for the process that is co-creation, of which we are a part. So there is so much more to explore in this wonderful fable. This was just a beginning, and our own understanding of it can include these elements and so much more. For now, we keep in mind that our consideration of these four elements, our motives, skills and gifts, our relation to the other, and our relation to the results, can make all the difference in how we show up to each other and to our world. Palmer says that by keeping these four elements in mind, King was not crafting a bell stand. He was crafting himself. So are we.